Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to If Deku Was a Demigod Part 4. Last time on the What If, the sports festival took place, and thanks to Izuku's powers and a bit of help from Zeus, Izuku was able to make it decently far into the competition. But after losing his fight against Todoroki, Izuku lost. Then after the sports festival, the hero internships began, with Izuku going with Ochako to the pro hero Gunhead's agency. And with that, Izuku learned how to fight better. Also, he was able to get better at controlling his powers, with him learning to make mini tornadoes. But during the internships, the attack at Hosu happened. And because of that, Ito was killed when he tried to fight Stan on his own. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's jump into the video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so begin this What If the day it was announced that Ito was killed by the hero killer, and Izuku and Ochako just got the news about his death. And when they learned about it, they were upset, and they felt like they should have done more. And after grieving for a couple hours, they went back to training, because they want to become even stronger than they were now, because they don't want this to happen again. Okay, so now we skip a couple weeks, so now it's time for the finals. And for the written portion of the exams, everyone got the same score as in the canon, for both the practice and the actual final. So now it's time for the students versus teachers exam. But more specifically, it's time for the match with Izuku and Bakugo against All Might. And currently, the two students were waiting outside the giant fake city. Then once the sirens rang out throughout the city, the doors leading into the city opened. And seeing this, the two ran straight towards the exit, with Izuku trying to be even quicker, using his air manipulation to dash, because he didn't want to have confrontation against All Might, because he knew he would lose. However, Bakugo was less secretive, with him firing his explosions, making him go flying around, kinda giving away their location. And after a couple minutes, the two were able to make it halfway across the city. Then before they were able to get farther, the two got blasted away by a giant gust of air that was strong enough to blast the two back all the way to the start. And it destroyed buildings and pieces of road, scattering dirt everywhere, creating a dirt cloud. And once the dirt cloud was slow enough, the two saw All Might. And seeing All Might, Bakugo jumped to his feet and began to fly towards All Might. And when he got to All Might, he began to fight the teacher, with him attacking him using his explosions, either directly or to power up his attacks by adding explosive power and momentum. But every attack Bakugo lands, it does just about nothing. And after a couple hits, Bakugo goes in for a kick. But once he landed it, All Might was able to grab Bakugo's leg and he slammed him down to the ground. And once Bakugo hit the ground, Izuku was finally able to recover from the gust of wind, so he isn't seeing double anymore. And seeing Bakugo get slammed into the ground, Izuku ran towards the two as fast as he could, using the air to propel him. And while he was running, he shouted the word fight, turning his gloves into shining knuckles. And he tried to go in for a punch, focusing his electricity into his hands. But before Izuku was able to punch All Might countered, and he moved out of the way. Then when Izuku was flying past him, he quickly grabbed Izuku's leg, and All Might chucked him at a building multiple stories up. But while Izuku was flying, he was manipulating the air around him to slow down his momentum. So by the time when Izuku got to the glass of the building, he was going slow enough to not crash immediately through it. And when Izuku got to the glass panels, he quickly angled himself down, and he jumped with as much force as he could, using the air to rocket himself back towards the ground at All Might. And while Izuku was flying up, Bakugo was able to regain consciousness, so he was back to fighting All Might again, meaning that All Might was distracted, so he wasn't able to react when Izuku came flying towards him. And when Izuku got to him, he completely wrapped himself around All Might. And when he was connected, he covered his whole body in electricity, shocking the #1 hero. And after a couple seconds, All Might to Izuku seems like he was shrinking, with his hair starting to droop. But before Izuku was sure, All Might began to spin like a top, creating a vortex around himself. And with that, Izuku was launched off of him, and he crashed into the first floor of a nearby building along with Bakugo. And when Izuku was able to recover after a couple seconds, All Might was still spinning. So while All Might was distracted, Izuku grabbed Bakugo and he began to dash using his air manipulation to run the two to the emergency exit, leading them into a side alleyway. So by the time All Might stopped spinning and the dirt was slow enough for him to actually see, he was able to see that the two students were gone. And in reality, they were actually a couple of alleyways away from where they originally began. And All Might, seeing this, began to run around to try to find the two. And when Izuku saw All Might trying to find them, he began to try to think of a plan to get to the exit. But it was a bit difficult because Bakugo wanted to defeat All Might in combat. And because Bakugo's feeling inept from how much Izuku has improved over the past year, he would rather lose the exam than work with him. But after a couple minutes of Izuku trying to convince Bakugo, he was finally able to make Bakugo reluctantly work with him. So then the two began to try to think of a plan that would allow them to get to the exit. And after around a few minutes of planning, they were able to come up with a plan. So Bakugo then gave Izuku one of his gauntlets, and they waited in separate alleyways. And after a couple minutes of waiting, All Might began to run towards the two students' alleyways. And when he was in the middle of the two alleyways, the two students jumped out, with Izuku being in front of him and Bakugo being behind him. And seeing Izuku just pop out of nowhere, All Might took a step back. But while All Might was in motion, Izuku and Bakugo pulled the pins that were on their gauntlets, which surrounded All Might in a giant explosion. And when the explosion was fired, All Might was in a daze. And with him like that, Izuku and Bakugo sped towards the exit as fast as they could, with Izuku using the air to push him and Bakugo flying alongside him, using his explosions. But after around a minute, All Might was able to recover from the attack, and he began to run at Izuku, with him appearing right next to Izuku after a few seconds. And before Izuku was able to react, All Might punched Izuku where his gauntlet was located, so it broke instantly. Then seeing this, Izuku electrified his hand and he went in for a punch aimed at All Might. But All Might was able to grab the electrified fist, and even though it was numbing and burning All Might was able to hold on for a few seconds. And with that couple of seconds, All Might was able to pull back and he punched Izuku in the side. And from that attack, Izuku went flying. But this time, because Izuku was distracted from the pain, he wasn't able to bounce back. So he crashed into a building multiple stories up. Then once Izuku landed, All Might appeared right next to Bakugo, and he grabbed Bakugo by his legs and he flung Bakugo in the same building he flung Izuku in. And when he landed, Bakugo saw Izuku on the ground in pain. And after a couple seconds, the two were able to get back up. And when they were both standing, they jumped out of the already broken window. And while they were in the air, Izuku used the air to push them down, making them rocket towards All Might. And when the two landed, they landed right in front of All Might, with Izuku dashing at All Might. And once he got to him, the two began to fight, with Izuku focused on dodging and trying to get quick taps in where he can shock All Might. And while Izuku was keeping All Might distracted, he shouted for Bakugo to run, which at first Bakugo was hesitant to, but he changed his mind when Izuku shouted for him to run again. And when All Might saw Bakugo run, he tried to run after him, but when he tried to take a step, Izuku shot towards All Might and he grabbed him, infusing as much electricity into All Might, which made him begin to have the same reaction as he did before. And before it was too much for All Might to handle, All Might did another quick spin, which flung Izuku again. But this time, with Izuku being somewhat ready, Izuku was able to easily recover, with him landing around 5 feet away. And when Izuku landed, All Might tried to run towards Bakugo again. But when Izuku saw this, he focused his attention on the air in front of All Might, and he used most of his remaining energy to manipulate the air towards him, creating somewhat of a vacuum. And with that, it also pushed All Might towards him. And because of that, it was hard for All Might to move, let alone take a step. Because not only is All Might heavily handicapped with the weights, but from the electric attack, he's been slowly going back to a small Might form, and his timer has been decreasing. And seeing that he needed to take care of Izuku, All Might sped towards Izuku and he punched him in the gut, which flung Izuku into a nearby building. Then after Izuku hit the building, All Might ran towards Bakugo as fast as he could. But because All Might was weakened and because Bakugo was already too close to the exit, he wasn't able to make it in time. And when Bakugo got to the finish line, an alarm rang out through the entire fake city, announcing that the students had passed the exam. Okay, so now we skip to the next day, and Class 1A was just told that even if they failed the exam, they will still be going to summer camp. And when class was over, Class 1A decided that they wanted to go shopping for the camp. And a couple minutes after getting to the mall, everyone had split up because they wanted to get all the things that they wanted to buy. And before Izuku was able to make it to a store, someone put their arm around Izuku. And the man told Izuku that it's been a while since he's last seen him, because the last time they seen each other was at the USJ. And hearing this, Izuku was able to put 2 and 2 together, and he was able to figure out that this was the leader of the attack at the USJ. And hearing this, Izuku was about to say the word fight, with him saying the first couple letters. But before he was able to say the whole word, Shigaraki put a hand out in front of Izuku and he shook a finger. And seeing this, Izuku stopped. Then Shigaraki told Izuku that he wouldn't do that if he were him. Then he told Izuku that he had his portal villain on standby, and that if Izuku moves in a way he doesn't like, he will warp an army of no-moves into the plaza. He then asked Izuku how many people would have to die because of him. And because Izuku doesn't know if it's a bluff or not, he goes along with it. And with that, Shigaraki led Izuku to a bench, and the two began to talk. And when they were done talking, Shigaraki came to the conclusion that All Might was at the center of all of his problems. And when he figured this out, he began to thank Izuku. But before he was done, Ochako showed up. And seeing this, Shigaraki said his final thank you. Then he walked into the crowd of civilians. And after a couple seconds, Shigaraki was lost in the crowd. So now we skip a couple hours, and the mall has been shut down, and Izuku has been taken to the police department for questioning. Okay, so now we skip to when the summer camp was about to begin. And after a couple hours on a bus, Class 1A stops at a mountain. And when they all get out of the bus, the class met the WWPC, who welcomed them to the camp. Then Pixie Bop pointed in the direction of the camp. And before they could question why she pointed to the camp, Pixie Bop began to manipulate the ground under them, and eventually she flung all of Class 1A off the cliff. And while the class was falling, Izuku used some of his energy to make a gust of wind around the class, which would allow the class to land softly. And when they landed, they were told to get to the camp as fast as they could. And hearing this, the class began to walk in the direction that Pixie Bop pointed in, and it went off without a problem at first. But after walking for a couple minutes, monsters made out of rock and stone appeared behind the shadows of the trees. And seeing them, Izuku transformed his knuckles, and he began to fight the monsters along with his class. And they kept on fighting the monsters until they eventually got to the camp. And by the time they got to the camp, the sun was setting. And when they made it, they were all tired and dirty, and feeling the downsides of their quirks, with Izuku feeling exhausted and someone feeling like he's on the brink of passing out. Okay, so now skip to the next morning, and by the time the sun rose, the training for Class 1A has begun. And everything that happened the previous night still happened, along with this thing with Koda, so Izuku knows about Koda's parents. And what Izuku spent around half the time doing the first day was the same as Kaminari, so he and Kaminari were standing in an empty area of the camp, and for the both of them there were giant batteries. And for hours on end, they were putting as much electricity into the batteries to power them up. And with that, Izuku was able to increase his electricity generation and stamina. Then the second half of the day was spent with Izuku being located in a different area, so he was isolated in the forest. And next to him was a barometer, and for as long as he could, he had to hold a tornado, with it constantly swirling around him. And with very little breaks as possible, he had to hold an F1 tornado. And with that, Izuku was able to train his stamina some more, and it allowed him to increase his air manipulation, and just blatantly allowed him to get better at complex air maneuvers. And when they were done training for the day, Class 1A and 1B had to make dinner. And when they were done and while Izuku was having dinner, Izuku knows that Koda wasn't there, so he got a plate of food and he began to dash, using the air to push him. And after a couple minutes of running, Izuku was able to find Koda on a cliff, looking at the stars. And when Izuku found him, he slowed down, and the two began to talk, with Koda asking why does Izuku want to be a hero so much. And Koda tells Izuku that he's just throwing his life away. And after a couple more minutes of talking, Izuku put down the plate of food. Then he jumped off the cliff and he began to jump from tree to tree back to camp. Okay, so now we skip to the next day, and the training Izuku did was different. Because this time, in the beginning of the day, Izuku spent the time running around the campgrounds, while Pixie Bob made rock monsters and various obstructions. And the training was that he had to circle around the camp as fast as he could, while at the same time he had to avoid different obstacles. And he had to use his air manipulation to get better at just moving around, which allowed him to get better at using his air manipulation to just move around. Then the second half of the day was Izuku being in the same place as where he made the tornadoes. But this time, he had to generate bolts of lightning as fast as he could, with him trying his best to withstand the backlash of energy drainage and the pain in his gut. And he did this training so he could get better at launching them without him passing out after one. So by the end of the day's training, Izuku's max was he was able to launch 2 bolts of lightning right after each other before he feels like he wants to pass out. And once the day was done, the WWPC decided that the 2 classes deserved a prize. So they decided to hold a test of courage, with all the groups being the exact same as in the canon, with Izuku being alone. But before he could go in, he and the other people outside the forest could see that the forest was covered in blue flames. Then 2 villains started to walk out of the forest, and they began to fight Pixie Bob, Mandalay, and Tiger. And while they were fighting, the students started to run to find a place to hide. But before Izuku could do anything, he remembered that Koda was most likely at the cliff. So he then told Mandalay where he was going, and when she heard this, she gave Izuku a nod. And seeing this, Izuku sped towards the cliff as fast as he could, using the air to push him. And after a few minutes, Izuku was able to get to a tree under the cliff. But even when he was this far away, Izuku saw a giant villain begin to walk towards Koda. And before the villain was able to get to him, Izuku jumped up, with him landing on the cliff right in front of Koda. So once he landed, Izuku shouted the word fight. And when he did, his gloves turned into shining knuckles. Then he dashed towards Muscular, using the air to push him, and he hit Muscular as hard as he could. And because Muscular wasn't expecting Izuku, he was surprised. So when Izuku made contact with Muscular, Muscular got flung a couple feet back, with Izuku landing where he hit Muscular. But surprisingly to Izuku, Muscular was able to tank the attack. And once Muscular was done skidding on the ground, he began to smirk. Then he began to wrap his body around with muscles, with him doubling in size. Then once the muscles were done increasing in size, Muscular began to run at Izuku. And before Izuku was able to react, Muscular was able to get to Izuku and he punched him in the gut, launching Izuku into the mountainside. And when Izuku crashed into the wall, Izuku's phone broke on impact, so he could no longer call for any backup. So when Izuku hit the wall, he fell to the ground. And when Izuku got back up, he ran at Muscular, and after dodging a couple of Muscular's attacks, Izuku was able to grab hold of Muscular. And when Izuku did, he electrified his body. And in the process, he was able to electrify Muscular, making his muscles start to tighten and spasm a bit, and burning from the inside. And feeling this, Muscular grabbed Izuku, who was on his back, and he slammed him into the mountain face first. Then once Izuku got hit, Muscular threw Izuku, making him land right next to Koda. And when Izuku got back up, he shouted for Koda to run and to not worry about him, while he holds Muscular back. But before Koda could even take a step back, the villain began to walk towards the two. And while he was walking, he told Izuku that he was actually on the list. So Muscular then asked if he knew a Bakugo, and where his current location was. But before Izuku could say anything, Muscular ran at Izuku. But before he was able to get to Izuku moved out of the way, using the air to push him. And Izuku countered by electrifying his hand and punching Muscular in the side, launching him into the mountain. And once Muscular got out of the crater that he just made, Izuku and Muscular began to fight, with Izuku using his energy on trying to do quick and fast attacks while electrocuting Muscular. While Muscular tried to attack Izuku with him just being barely slower than Izuku. And because his muscles are getting shrunken, he just keeps on adding muscle to himself, making it so the electricity is doing practically nothing but wearing down his stamina. But sadly, after a couple minutes of fighting between the two, Izuku got hit in the stomach, making him land on the ground. And when Izuku landed, he was tired from the combat, so he was trying his best to get back up. And while Izuku was getting back up, Muscular decided to stop holding back, so he put his quirk into overdrive, and he ran towards Izuku, pulling his arm back for a punch. And seeing this, Izuku quickly jumped back to his feet, and he sped towards Muscular as fast as he could. But when the two collided, it was obvious that Muscular was way stronger than Izuku, even with Izuku's momentum and super strength. But while Izuku was holding Muscular back for a couple seconds, Izuku shouted for Koda to run, while he keeps Muscular back. But before Koda could move, Muscular was finally able to overpower Izuku, and he pushed Izuku into the ground, and he began to get crushed. And seeing this as the end, Izuku tried to use all of his energy, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push him off. And after a couple seconds, Izuku began to lose consciousness. But before Izuku could get completely crushed, Koda shot out water at Muscular using his quirk, and he shouted to let him go, which made Muscular get distracted for a couple seconds. And using this to Izuku's advantage, Izuku began to lift Muscular up slowly, while slowly getting up. And while Izuku was getting up, he was getting full of adrenaline, just coursing through his body. So he began to yell, and he began to feel electricity all around him, beginning to dance and move faster and faster, was getting stronger and stronger after every second. Then after around 30 seconds, a bolt of lightning smites the two where they stood. And when the bolt of lightning hit, it made a giant boom, launching dirt and rock in multiple directions. And with Muscular being above Izuku, it hits him directly, with electrifying Izuku. But because he's the son of Zeus, it doesn't affect him at all. And when the bolt hit Muscular, he was covered with second-degree burns all across his body, and almost all of his muscles that Muscular made from his quirk were completely burned away. And Muscular's body was twitching from the electricity circulating through him. And with that, Izuku pushed Muscular off of him and he crawled away. Then once he was free, he walked over to Koda to make sure he was okay. And once Izuku felt like he can keep going after a couple minutes, Izuku picked up Koda and he began to run through the forest. And he used his air manipulation to speed through the forest even faster. And after a couple minutes of running, the two find Aizawa, who when he saw Izuku told him to give Mandalay a message. And after Izuku gave Koda to Aizawa, Izuku ran to the camp as fast as he could. And when he got back to the camp, Mandalay and Tiger were still fighting the villains. So Izuku ran at Spinner, who was fighting Mandalay, and he punched him in the gut, which flung him into a tree a couple feet away. And while Spinner was trying to get back up, Izuku gave Mandalay the message that Aizawa gave him, which was he has given permission to the students to fight the villains. And when he was done giving the message, Mandalay sent the message to all the students. And after Mandalay sent out the message, Izuku began to run to the woods to find Bakugo. And after a couple minutes of running in the forest, he gets pushed to the ground by some large person. And when Izuku looked up to see who pushed him, he saw Shoji, who was all bloody. And when he saw Shoji, he asked him what had happened to him. And in response, Shoji pointed to a nearby tree. And when Izuku looked at it, it looked perfectly fine. And he was about to say what was he pointing at. But before he could even finish his sentence, a giant dark hand slashed at it, cutting the tree in half. Shoji then began to explain that Tokoyami lost control over Dark Shadow, and now he's on a rampage. And seeing this, Izuku and Shoji began to run to try to figure out a plan while still avoiding Dark Shadow's attacks. And after a couple minutes of running, the two were able to come up with a plan, so they began to run to find Bakugo and Todoroki. And while they were running, they were using Shoji's limbs as bait so Dark Shadow would keep on following them. And after a couple more minutes of running, they were finally able to find Todoroki and Bakugo, who were fighting the villain Moonfish. And when they got to the villain, they straight up jumped over him. And before Moonfish was able to get out of the way, Dark Shadow ran straight into him and he slammed him into a tree, which when Moonfish made contact got instantly knocked out. Then Izuku shouted for Bakugo and Todoroki to fire their flames at Tokoyami, and after a couple minutes, the two were able to weaken Dark Shadow enough so Tokoyami was able to gain control again. And after they calmed down Tokoyami, the group began to think of a way to get back to the camp. And after a couple minutes, they decided to have Tokoyami and Bakugo in the back, while the other three were in front of them, so that Bakugo wouldn't get picked off so easily. Then after some time walking in silence, the group comes across Sue stuck to a tree, and Ochako getting her blood drained by a villain that is standing above her. And when the villain saw the group of students, she quickly got to her feet, and she ran into the forest. And because the group was focused on their injured classmates, the group decided to not go after her. And when the group was able to get the two back to their feet, Izuku explained to the two that they were making sure that Bakugo made it back to camp. But when Izuku said this, Sue pointed out that Bakugo wasn't behind them. And seeing this, the group looked back, and when they did, they saw that not only was Bakugo gone, but Tokoyami was gone as well. And seeing this, the remaining members of the group began to look around. And after a couple minutes of searching, when Izuku looked up and paid attention, he realized that there was someone standing on the tree above them. And when the villain realized that Izuku saw him, he introduced himself as Mr. Compress. And when he was done with the introduction, he showed two marbles, which when they looked closely contained Bakugo and Tokoyami. And seeing this, Todoroki shot out a wave of flames, which the villain was able to dodge with ease. Then the villain began to jump away on top of the trees. And seeing this, Izuku tried to jump at the villain, but the villain was just out of his range. So seeing this, Izuku decided to run with the group after him, because he didn't want to risk the chance of him getting caught as well. But after a couple minutes of running, it was obvious that this wouldn't work, because the villain was starting to get out of their line of sight. So Izuku began to think, and after a couple seconds, he was able to come up with a plan which was the same as in the canon. So Todoroki, Izuku, and Shoji stacked on top of each other, while Ochako made the three weightless. And while the three were light, Sue used her tongue to throw the three, making them fly towards the villain. And while the three were flying, Zuko focuses his attention on the air around them, making the air push them even more, making them go flying even faster towards the villain. And after a couple seconds, they were able to make impact with the villain, and they landed on top of him. And when they look around, they find themselves at the rendezvous point for the villains. So right in front of them, there's a giant portal and a group of villains. But before they could do anything, Mr. Compress threw the marbles he had. Then he turned himself into a marble. Then when he was a couple feet away, he turned himself back to normal. Then the two groups began to fight. And after a bit of time, Mr. Compress shows the marbles in his mouth. But when he reveals the marbles, a laser beam comes out of nowhere, and it hits him in the face, making the marbles fly out of his mouth. And while the marbles were flying, Shoji was able to grab a marble, and Todoroki tried to grab the marble that was in front of him. But when he tried to grab it, Dabi was able to grab it before him, while Todoroki fell to the ground. Then when Dabi grabbed the marble, Mr. Compress undid his quirk, revealing that Dabi had Bakugo. So Bakugo was being slowly dragged into the portal. And seeing this, Izuku tried to run towards him to try to save him, but before he was able to get to him, his body gave out from everything he had done the whole day, making him fall to the ground. Then once Bakugo and the remaining members of the league got into the portal closed behind them. Then hours later, ambulances arrived to take the injured people to the hospital, and the cops arrived to take the Bean villains to jail. And that's really What If. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time on Something Z.